record now. Okay,
Bang.
so we're here, we're live. Okay, brilliant. Okay, welcome. This is Sam Kovac, and you're watching Parkour Coach Companion. I'm here with the mighty Chris Keighley, and he's got his Mr. Strong mug.
Very it's important. It's attending all meetings with me these days.
Excellent. It's a big mug as well. That looks like the size of you.
It's basically head size. My youngest brother, who also trains, got it for me for Christmas.
Nice.
A few years back, and it is normally full of tea, but full of water today.
Yeah, good choice. So how are you doing, Chris? I know that well, off air we talked about a recent accident that you had.
Yeah, non-training injury. Otherwise, lockdown's been very good to me. I'm privileged enough to have my own garden. Even before I moved into the house, we built a gym in the back garden, so I've had access to a great deal more in the way of like facilities and places to enjoy them than a lot of people have.
Sure.
So aside from deciding that headbutting my roof was a good idea, everything else has been going fine.
Yeah, good. And you're right in the middle of London as well, so obviously you've are you?
People that lived here would say that I'm very much on the outskirts. If you ever speak to Andy Day, he will tell you I don't even live in London. He's wrong. But for those familiar with the transport system, I'm out in Zone 5, which is quite close to the perimeter. I'm on one of the external boroughs of London. So if you go further out, it becomes Watford.
Yeah. Okay. And for those that don't know, or I guess new to this channel or whatever, then could you just explain what you do, where you coach, and
yeah, sure. So I coach with Parkour Generations primarily in London at our academy classes, either over at the Chain Store Gym or a range of outdoor classes that we have around London as well. I also tutor the ADAPT qualifications internationally, so parkour coaching qualifications around the world. And I also coach and tutor the Parkour UK Level 1 and Level 2 qualifications in the UK.
Okay, cool. So how long have you? Well, it's been a while now, I imagine. But how long have you been? How long have you been a coach? How long have you been a parkour coach?
So I transitioned into coaching. It's either March or April 2007. It's about 13 years now. I started parkour after Jump London back in 2003, and before Parkour Generations existed, when Forrest and Dan and Stefan were doing some coaching with Urban Free Flow, I started going to the academy once it moved over to West London. And after a couple of years, they set up their own group and company, and they asked me if I would like to come on board and teach with them.
And did you I guess there wasn't a huge gap of time between you coaching and you starting training, and that was kind of quite early days, really. So did you kind of see coaching as something that you naturally got into, or was it something that kind of you thought, this is a passion of mine, and I quickly want to spread this sort of thing?
Yeah. So although I hadn't really considered parkour coaching when I first got into parkour, I was already teaching steel pans, which is a musical instrument from Trinidad and Tobago.
Really?
Yeah. I've been learning that since I was 8. And when it was either like late college or early university, but my teacher there asked me if I was able to help out with some of our local borough after school music programs.
Yeah.
So I began helping there. Then there was a school that he formerly taught at but couldn't teach it anymore. He asked me if I'd be interested in taking over there. So I did, which was round about the same time that I started parkour. So I found parkour when I was 19, had just gone to university. So I was teaching steel pans, beginning to practice parkour. And so when I started going to classes, I'd already been training out with the community for a couple of years around London anyway. So at the time that Dan and Forrest and Stefan asked me to come on board, I think I've been training for about 3.5 years. But I actually had an equal or slightly more time of experience of teaching. Now, it's obviously teaching something very different, but a lot of the skills are transferable, knowing how to manage a group, manage your time within the class setting. So I think both probably a slightly broader amount of parkour experience than a lot of the other students in the class, and some teaching skills and experience kind of melded me into a fairly useful candidate to come on board and help them spread parkour through the classes.
And do you still do any steel pans now?
I still play, but I don't teach anymore. It was one of the, and it's interesting because when I first started parkour coaching, it was within a year of graduating, and I'd had worked in merchandising whilst I was at university. So I left uni not immediately needing to think about, okay, what is my job or my career plan, but kind of having a couple of different avenues of, well, I'll see if I can make steel pan teaching grow and do that full time, or maybe I go into merchandising in a more full-time way, and I can just let them kind of feel themselves out. And then parkour coaching came into the mix as well. And it's like, well, this is great. Now I've got 3 things, and I'll just kind of see, do I keep a balance? Does one of them kind of take over? Sure. And because with parkour coaching, there was a group and a team of us, it was much more flexible that if I needed to go away or do something, there was someone else that could step in and do that teaching. Whereas with something like steel pan teaching, it's much, much harder to get someone to come in and cover you for 6 weeks, and people are learning specific songs. So although you want some continuity if you are getting parkour coaches to cover you, I think there's still a lot more latitude in how they want to do those lessons, or building on what they can see in front of them, rather than having to know the very specific things that you need to be taught in that time. So I think a combination of that flexibility was one of the big pragmatic things that made me go down that line. And also I think because it was relatively early in any kind of parkour career or industry, there were a lot of opportunities in those first couple of years, and not that many people that were able to kind of step up and provide that. Whereas now there's a much, much bigger array of coaches and organizations. So there's still a lot of work, but the opportunities are spread amongst a much larger group of quite competent people.
So essentially, would you say that, you've formed a career of parkour coaching?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, it is essentially the only full-time job I've had since I graduated. So I was lucky that in many ways I fell into it. And because I have always been a coach and a provider and not a business owner, a lot of those challenges of parkour business ownership haven't fallen to me. So I consider myself very fortunate that I get to do all the exciting bits of the job without any of the more tedious background parts, for the most part.
Yeah. And I saw recently, I think something from Parkour Generations saying about how obviously the coronavirus has affected level 1 candidates trying to get their hours signed off for level 2. Is that right? Sorry, by level 2s. So
essentially, with the ADAPT program, there's supervised hours that you need to do to complete your level 1 certification. And the reality is just there's very, very few parkour classes going on in the world right now, and certainly maybe none in the countries that candidates find themselves. So I think just the most responsible thing is to give people the time to complete that, because we want people to be able to go through the certification and continue growing as coaches. But now's a very challenging environment to try and make that happen in. So as we want to strike the best balance possible between making sure that people are actually improving and taking it seriously, but also giving them the opportunities to do so in a responsible way without making anyone sick.
Exactly. And also on that point, shout out, if anyone watching is level 1 and happens to be watching this, then get in contact with Chris, and myself, I'm level 2 coach as well. So if you need any help, then yeah, you can chat with us. And funny enough, I guess in a strange way, Chris was the person's brain who I had to change in order to get my level 2 passed, which was,
yes.
When did I get my level 2? I think it was 2016, yeah, I think it's 2016.
4 years ago sounds about right.
Yeah, which is crazy, because I can remember very much the nerves and the feeling of like, I've got to get this right. I've got to change this man's mind so that he'll give me a tick,
Yeah, I would like to think of it as convincing me rather than changing my mind.
Yes.
I think any assessor should go into those situations with an open mind as to what they see in front of them. You had more hair back then as well.
I did, and I've gone for the quarantine.
Yeah.
So it's not. I haven't aged beyond.
Wow.
Well, we'll see.
We've all aged. It's the one thing we can't hold back.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about. I guess the main thing I'm interested in is what I'm trying to, I guess, do with talking to these different coaches, is first of all get more conversations going, but also I want to try and pick the right fruit from people's brains, and I think that what I'm interested in your thoughts are is, I guess, within the context of this podcast and what you can talk about, what are the key elements that you think really have been essential to good teaching practice, and also boiling down to this big question of what helps people improve. What are the greatest beneficiaries to people's progression? So I mean, take that how you want. It's a very big question.
It's a very broad thing.
Yeah. But if you can think of any things in particular that are useful, then yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we start at kind of just our most base responsibilities, obviously the most fundamental thing for any parkour coach is just to create safe environments in which to practice. So in terms of outdoor spaces, community-wide, it's very clear that, check your surfaces, check your obstacles. But I think as a coach, there's always going to be a responsibility of making sure that however much we encourage our students to do that for themselves, the responsibility ultimately falls to us. And so not just kind of checking them, but making sure the environment is really prepared for all of the deliberate, but also the unintended consequences of training on those. And I think a lot of people just think like, well, as long as it's safe for doing this thing well, it's safe to use in class. But actually, a lot of the time, it's going to be people doing it either badly because let's say they've undershot a jump and so they're hitting obstacles horizontally, or whether it's simply that they're placing a lot more stress and contact upon those obstacles because they're newer to parkour, newer to sport, whatever it may be. And I think if we just look at the basic safety concerns, probably the number one mistake is people thinking, oh, this is good for doing parkour like well or neatly on it. And that's the criteria they use for creating a safe environment. Whereas actually it's like, is it safe for people to behave quite badly on this? Is actually a much better base point for us to start from as parkour coaches. And then once we've gone from a safe environment, we want to create hopefully an enjoyable environment for training in. And that's going to come down to partly the types of activities we choose, but also the environment and the social environment that we create within classes as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I chose the word enjoyable quite carefully because I think a lot of coaches talk about creating fun environments. And I think fun is a much more nebulous thing. And that ultimately, that there's some things that I can find very, very fun, but not that meaningful. And so although it was an enjoyable one-off experience, I'm less likely to go back to it. Whereas an enjoyable class can be enjoyed for a number of reasons. It might be that they find it fun, but it might be that they find it really worthwhile or really challenging. And so kind of understanding individual students' needs of what they enjoy is much more key to creating an enjoyable environment for everyone than just thinking, I want to make this class fun. Fun's always a good base point, and especially if you find yourself teaching younger students and newer students, I think that's a really good starting point, because that will motivate people and will help them enjoy it on an initial level. But as people become more, I don't want to say intense with their training, but maybe as they're starting to take it more, more focused, they're starting to take it more seriously, or they're maybe expanding the types of goals they want to achieve through their training. I think you don't want to go home from a miserable experience, because that will be very demotivating. But I don't know that it's fun necessarily that will keep everyone coming back. For sure, there's a lot of people that is the case, and there's some groups where the idea of either fun or play as a learning tool is really, really important. But for me, I think as long as people are achieving what they want to through the classes, then that will bring a sense of enjoyment and kind of satisfaction that will help keep bringing them back.
Sure. And for on a typical day, I mean, for me, one of the greatest challenges, particularly when you're talking about this kind of this sense of helping people, enjoy the session and be fulfilled in the session. A big challenge I find is, on a given day, I could be teaching, 8-year-olds up to 16 plus or whatever, and sometimes within the space of a few hours. And I find it very difficult to kind of being able to quickly switch between different ways of teaching and different attitudes that I project to the appropriate group, if you get me.
Yeah.
Do you find that as well? Do you have, like, I don't really know what your typical day of coaching looks like, but I imagine that you do teach different age groups and stuff.
Yeah, and I think probably the day, well, prior to our current lockdown situation, but the day that most encapsulated the range was my Sunday classes used to be family class in the morning, which is anything from like 2 to 7-year-olds with their parents in the same space, and then go to the chainsaw afterwards, teach our adult parkour classes, which are 14 up. And I would say the most common age range is 14 to 50, but we will have people older than that attend the classes as well. And I think having this idea of what do different students value helps me find it quite easy to switch, because if I can have a clear idea for myself of what are the different values, and can I have an exercise where people want, or people that are looking for fun, they can find the fun in this, but people are looking for challenge can find the challenge in this, and people are looking for, I don't know, the novelty, or I've done something I've not done before, can find that in it, then it makes it much easier for me to just kind of emphasize those elements to different students. And then whether that's age range or personality, the content doesn't always have to change that much. It's just the way that I frame it for the students. And I think if all you have to change is the framing and not the whole structure and the whole nature of the class, it becomes easier to switch between these kind of coaching personalities than if every class feels like a completely different and unique entity.
Yeah, I like that. That's cool. Do you find that are you much more, I mean, I've talked to a few coaches already, and there's kind of some differences. Are you like a very tight planner for the way that you kind of get ready to do a session, or are you more improvised, or are you, I can imagine probably which one you are, but
I would imagine that you would guess that I'm the second of the two.
No, I thought you'd be a planner.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is this because of how important I stress planning is via various courses, or just by my nature?
Potentially, but I guess from experience in your, you taking on the level 2 course, it seemed it seemed very structured and kind of well.
Yeah. Well, so interestingly, I'd say that tutoring a course and teaching a parkour class are very, very different beasts. And so so when I am tutoring a course, yes, there's a much, much higher level of planning. There's a much more rigid framework. I'm much more careful about, okay, exactly which location are we going to use for each part, because that will maximize the value of each part.
Absolutely.
Whereas for me with the parkour class, I never go in blind. I think my basic approach is always to have 2 or 3 key ideas that I want to incorporate into the session.
Yeah.
And then build towards those. And the reason I don't like to overplan my sessions is simply that I believe, rightly or wrongly, that I'm quite good at making very quick decisions about how to develop ideas.
Yeah.
So what it ends up with is a relatively unplanned but very cohesive class. So as it develops, I can link back, I can choose to do this, and I know we're prepared for this because of these things that we did in the warm-up, and I can make those links for my students. So hopefully they come across as planned, and they are planned, but they are planned as they go along. So it's never just a case of, okay, and now we'll do this random thing. There's always a reason for the choice that I'm making. But because it's not rigidly planned, and because the nature of our classes is that often people might sign up a few hours before a class, or some people might turn up that you don't even know are going to be there, it lets me respond to that dynamic situation much easier than having a more rigid plan. And some of our coaches plan a great deal more than me, and it brings advantages to the class, and probably the instruction is a little bit clearer for the students because they can simply set up things in a way that you can't if you are adjusting the class as you go. But it means that if I know people have found something particularly challenging, I can either throw out the next idea that I wanted to go to for a little while and then spend more time focusing on that and developing those ideas. Or equally, if they found something particularly easy, I can rapidly escalate it to a point that I may not necessarily have thought about in advance.
Yeah.
But I think for people thinking about which approach they choose, they really need to critically evaluate, if they are making decisions in the moment, how valuable does the effect of those decisions end up being for your students? So just because you can make decisions quickly, if they end up being relatively valueless, then perhaps more planning in advance is going to be a much more critical thing for that coach. If you know that, well, if I'd had half an hour to make that decision, I'd have come to the same choice, then maybe that's an indication that you could be a little bit more flexible in how you develop the class as you go along. But I would say that if you are developing the class as you go, that's not the same as making it up as you go along. It's always how do I expand on what has happened already in the class rather than and now choose a new random exercise.
Sure. And you kind of touched on this before, but do you when you have these, few ideas before you go into a class, do you base your classes around things like principles and I guess attributes of movement, or do you think of like, okay, well, these guys are pretty inexperienced with vaulting, so we're going to dedicate this amount of time to vaulting? Or do you, how does that kind of float in your mind before you enter a class?
I mean, I think the nature of the class changes which approaches are open to me quite a lot. So for instance, our ongoing parkour classes will almost always have a mix of very experienced students that have been coming to classes, and we're measuring it in years, and potentially people that are there for their first day. So I'm typically for those classes, I'm always going to try and have 2 different types of ideas. One being, if this is someone's first day, I want them to have an experience with some obstacles that they can go away thinking, okay, I now know how to interact with that obstacle. Not that there's only one way of doing it, but that if they encounter similar situations again in the future, they've got a clear idea of how can I try and traverse this or deal with this movement challenge. But a lot of my students will already have those tools. So I also want to have a separate idea of, if you are familiar with those situations, what am I going to try and help you improve on today? And that's where having a more attribute of movement or a movement skill will give me a clear idea, because it's very easy to meld those two things together. If you've never done this before, you are going to focus more on the individual obstacles. If that's something that you're already familiar with, today you're going to try and do it as fast as you can, or as smoothly as you can, or with as little as planning as you can, and just adapt as you go in as many different ways. So I'll try and give them a clear criteria, because it helps people focus their training. And that way, 10 repetitions helps me assess if they're improving, but also helps them get a sense of, am I improving? Whereas if it's just, okay, we're doing vaulting, but you already know this, do this 10 times, it becomes a lot more hit and miss as to whether people are able to use that as valuably as they can for themselves. Not that they're incapable of doing it. And at any time I can see my students deviating but in a way that I think is useful for them individually and not having a negative impact on the rest of the class, I'm generally happy to let that student go down that rabbit hole. But I want to make sure that if they don't have that clear idea, that I'm able to provide that context and that structure for them within the class.
Cool. That's interesting. Do you tend to have a kind of formula for the structure of the class, as in like warm up, technical, conditioning, that sort of thing? Is that more free flowing as well, or is that something that you kind of have in mind?
So for our indoor classes, I think I often have a slightly more typical structure, and we'll spend a lot more time doing some explicit warm up activities, partly because we have a little bit more kind of space that allows for that, whereas in an outdoor environment, sometimes you're lucky and you've got a very wide open space, but sometimes it might be a much more congested area, so it's going to naturally segue into more movement-based activities quite early on. But I tend not to have a particularly rigid structure. If the kind of needs of the class allows, I've naturally segued towards having, let's say, maybe the most demanding physical challenges towards the end of the class, so that students can feel a little bit fresher for some of the other elements. But there will be times when I actually intentionally want people to feel more physically drained whilst having to do those movement tasks, because if your technique is only good when you're fresh, then that's a much more limited context in which you're able to express that technique and those movement skills. So there will be times when I deliberately switch it around, but as a general rule, I will try and leave the most physically demanding things towards the end of the class. Or I will try and make sure that if we include some very physically demanding work as part of the warm-up, which is not unheard of, but then the initial activities after the warm-up, I'll try and allow them to recover or regain any strength that they may need for the more demanding technical parts of the class. But in terms of format, it's quite open. The more people in the class, the more important I think the format becomes, simply in terms of group management. So if you've got more than 20 people in the class, the need to split people into smaller groups and find ways of moving those groups around the space and the drills becomes much more important. And that's when I'll probably revert to a more rigid format, to maybe doing circuits of different exercises and drills. But if I'm closer to 10 people, it gives me a lot more flexibility in how I build that class, responding to the needs of the students as we go along.
And one thing I've been thinking about quite a lot is the idea of a kind of syllabus, coaching syllabus, parkour syllabus. And I'm vaguely aware that these types of things exist amongst coaches in different places. Personally, I've tried to kind of make a kind of parkour skill matrix of different attributes of movement, just to kind of like have it down in front of me and see, like, this is what we can this is what we can teach. These are the progressions, and I think maybe one of my aims, whether in lockdown or not, is to create some sort of body of work of essentially parkour coaching and send it to lots of coaches, have it ripped completely apart, and then, you know, build it up and make something quite substantial. So I was wondering, in terms of, you know, you working with Parkour Generations and stuff, is there something that you and others follow, or is it more kind of due to, you know, you're very experienced now, so you have a very clear idea of what works and what doesn't work, and how to help people learn vaults and how to help people jump better and things like that. But is there anything that you guys have kind of made essentially that's some sort of guideline?
There's a few different things. Certainly when we have our introductory courses, they follow a much tighter syllabus because for a start, we've got a much more homogenous group of people, still a very diverse group athletically and with life experience, but certainly as it relates to the experience of parkour, they're a much more homogenous group. And also it's a much more clearly defined period. So I think anytime you know this is a fixed term course, whether it's a term at a school or a 6-week course you're running, your ability to be like, well, okay, well, these are the most important things because I might not see these people again. So I think it becomes, I don't want to say linear because it's still got so many permutations and ways that it can go, but I think it does become very much this is week 5, it's going to build on what we did in week 3 or whatever it may be. Whereas for a lot of our other classes, it's not just the case that we've got people that have been coming for years and people that have only been coming for, you know, a session or two, but also that we've deliberately tried to create an academy where people can go to different nights. So it might be that you go to a Monday for a couple of weeks, but then you go to the Wednesday class. And I think having, you know, like 10, 20 classes a week, all moving through the same syllabus, would remove the possibility for people to come multiple times a week and feel like they're really getting pushed and stretched in the same way. So I think there's always going to be limitations, but also possibilities in terms of how your class structure more broadly works. And if it is same people every week, that just allows the ability for you to build on in a much more deliberate way than if these are people that you might only see only once every 2 months, but are training potentially multiple times a week regardless. So I think that's one context. When I go to a school, I tend to have a much more fixed idea, I would say based more around types of movement situations or types of obstacles rather than specific techniques. And I've kind of moved away. So there will be some, we can call it vaulting type, but essentially there'll be some balancing type. How do you deal with thin obstacles? There'll be some vaulting. How do you deal with kind of waist high obstacles? How do you deal with moving between platforms or gaps? And generally, partly because they're so easily available and partly because I do find they've always been quite motivating for students, but some kind of how do you deal with vertical walls, whether that's wall runs or tic-tacs, whatever it may be. And in many ways, in a 6-week or like a half term at 8 weeks at a school, like I don't know that a tic-tac or wall run is going to have a huge difference to their life, but I do want to give them some sense of this is another type of obstacle that you can use and engage with, and possibly depending on the students might change. You know, are we just doing tic-tacs just with the foot? Are we doing it where you're going over a box and you're using your hand to help you? Are we just going to do some wall run type work instead? But as long as they've got some experience of engaging in that different movement environment, then I think that provides new value to them. So my syllabus is much more situational like that, or obstacle based, rather than necessarily specific technique based.
Yeah, well, it's funny you mention this, because when I was speaking with Tom Taylor in the previous episode, we did touch on on, for me, a sort of bit of a debate in my head at the moment about whether parkour is moving away as a practice, away from the obstacle, and is becoming more about the movement. And you know, obviously there's additional debate about, you know, whether Instagram and YouTube and everything, where parkour lies within these medias, and how and which ones are better at inspiring and helping other people. And I've kind of in my mind thought that maybe in some ways Instagram is definitely highlighting the movement of parkour. It's not as much about the obstacle, and maybe the more long form traditional parkour video that you see on YouTube, maybe it's intrinsically about the obstacle, because you're seeing more. You're seeing a spot being used. So for example, Vauxhall is so iconic, and not necessarily because of the movements, which were obviously very varied and incredible in their own ways, but as a spot, it was a centerpiece that people could focus on. And I wonder as well, maybe on a deeper level, whether this moving away from the obstacle to the focus on movement is actually becoming demotivating for people. And because essentially focusing on movement leads itself to comparison, and then feeling a bit shit about yourself. You know, seeing you know, Verky doing standing on a thin wall, backflip to 1 foot, double cork off, or whatever it was. You know, that's incredible. But I wonder whether a sense of satisfaction that may have been found previously in more of just the, oh wow, this is a new obstacle, it's a new place that I've explored, and I can do a few things around it, is now something, well, I can't do a congainer, so, you know.
Yeah, I mean, there were both good and bad points to that. I think one of the good things is that I think the parkour community has always had a slight issue with fetishizing certain spots. So yes, Vauxhall was great, but everyone went there because it was great. I mean, South Bank is still that, and maybe even fetishizing certain movements within those spots. I think the IMAX, the Concat, Con Precision, Con Clear, like,
yeah,
it becomes very, it draws people in. And maybe that was a good example of probably the combination of those two things, where it's like, it's very specific movements in very specific locations, and people end up chasing those things. I think there's a lot of inspiration you can draw, for whether it's watching people in real life or watching them on various forms of social media. But I think as soon as it moves away from inspiring people and more into inviting comparison, there's always going to be some negatives to that, whether it's feelings of inadequacy in a more direct comparative way, or whether it's a loss of creativity in the sense of how people are thinking about their movement and their environment. And I think even more than the negativity, from a parkour perspective, I think that loss of creativity is worse, possibly from a mental health perspective. The feelings of inadequacy and comparison is the more dangerous of the two. But in terms of what I believe parkour to be and how I conceptualize parkour, I think the movement is a result of the environment that you find yourself in. And that kind of causal relationship for me is still very much at the heart of the practice. So anytime that relationship gets flipped, it's not always bad. And there will be times when kind of the physical and mental challenge of being able to move in a very specific way is absolutely still, for me, part of the practice. But when it just becomes chasing those techniques or adding an extra spin or whatever it may be, I think it started to lose sight a little bit of kind of what makes parkour unique. And part of what makes parkour relatively unique is the idea of being able to traverse your environment. And it doesn't have to be in a very direct locomotive, or I believe as people like to say, efficient way. But it's still about cultivating a relationship between the practitioner and the environment that they find themselves in, and being adaptable to those different environments. And if an environment doesn't give you the possibility to do the movements that you want to do, then that, I mean, in many ways, that's great, because that forces you to adapt and think creatively about both the space and how to move. Whereas a lot of people just go and look for a better spot. And again, that loses for me a little bit of the essence of what parkour is.
And I guess on that point, do you said you've been around for a long time now, a lot longer than, well, a lot of people really, in the parkour scene, especially in the UK. And how do you honestly feel about the changes with parkour and its practice? Because you can see you've seen these changes, whereas a lot of younger people, they are now growing up on, I don't know, Ed Scott and growing up on Tim Champion and stuff, and that by no means is a bad thing. But for you, you've seen so much change. That how do you feel about parkour as a practice and its evolution?
Broadly, I have a conflict within myself, which is I strongly want to keep a lot of what I believe makes parkour special from the first place, and how it began. So the sense of challenge, the sense of developing an environment, a relationship with your environment, and about it being adapting to your environment rather than the movement itself. So there's a very conservative part of me that believes strongly in its roots, and I want to keep them there. But then there's also a part that if you are just rigid and limited to that in itself is excluding part of what parkour is, which was, it's a way of exploring, and you can't explore without growing and evolving in some way. So there's a contradiction in the heart of the practice to some extent. And I think if we look at some of the, just because I happened to see it again in a video a couple of days ago, let's take the side flip precision that was done at Canada Water. I forget who it was that did it first.
Max Barker,
Yes, exactly. But so the first time that happened, for me, that wasn't necessarily about the movement, because that's still like, how can I interact with this environment? This is a way I can do it. And it was a great technical, possibly physical and mental challenge to do that. And it was also a creative way of using the space, because no one had really seen that done before. So actually, in many ways, the people that are doing a lot of those things for the first time, to me, I don't see that necessarily as being an evolution of parkour as much as a very good encapsulation of what parkour is. The trouble then just becomes when everyone's trying to then copy and replicate that, rather than necessarily those specific evolutions. And again, like people might do side flip precisions all over the place now. I'm not one of those people, but it's more common. But when people are doing it in more interesting 3D environments, so one of the nice things about Canada Water, for people that aren't very familiar with that spot, is the railing isn't quite at the same height as the wall that you're going to be taking off from. You have to step up to the wall. The railing isn't even flat; it's at an angle. So actually, it's a relatively unique environment for that spot. Whereas people that are just going and finding a gap to do it over, for the sake of being able to do a side flip precision, I think is very different. So for me, there's still, even if we take that style of movement and expression, there's still a big difference between what looks like someone just trying to choose a place that they can do that, and someone doing that style of movement through a much more interesting environment. And again, I don't want to necessarily fetishize obvious parkour spots too much, because just because a spot maybe appears quite limited at first doesn't mean it's a bad parkour spot.
Exactly.
So I don't want to say that you have to go and find a really, really convoluted spot in which to move, in case I'm giving that impression. But I do think sometimes I get a sense that this spot was only chosen because it let you do this movement. And that's where I think there's the difference, rather than I came to this spot and I tried to meld what I'm capable of with what this spot offers, and this is the product of those two separate things.
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting in itself to talk about this idea of creativity. I remember quite well on my level 1 course with Dan Edwards, and Dan saying, creativity isn't necessarily finding new movements. It's creativity comes from being limited. And I thought, I wasn't sure at first, and I kind of agreed. And I've come from a tiny village in the middle of basically on the North York Moors. And for many years, basically just dealt with a few rails and a bridge. And that was my home. That was my training ground. And that taught me a lot. And so I find the word creativity, I find it really interesting how people talk about it, because obviously as well, you have people who are much more on the maybe you could say line side of things, who are thinking of different combinations of different movements. So Red Bull Art of Motion and this kind of style of movement, or free running, or however you want to define it. And it's funny to me that we can kind of use creativity in that sense, but also for me that means something so different to being creative with a simpler setting, where it's, again, like you say, it's not really, can I link a Webster into into whatever. It's, oh, well, this wall is at a slightly strange angle. I wonder if I could get from there to there in this way. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think creativity has so many different elements to it that using it as a buzzword on its own can be relatively meaningless. So we can talk about a very creative use of space, and using a space in a way that people wouldn't have thought. And if you take 100 athletes and 90 of them all have the same idea about how to move that through that space, even if it is in a very acrobatic way and like using lots of unusual movements, but they've done it 10 times in other spots each as well, then I don't know how truly creative that is. So like one of the questions I pose to candidates when on the coaching courses and they're teaching creativity is to ask people at the end of the session, like, did you do anything like new? Did you create anything that you haven't done before? And if the answer's no, then even if it's moving in a more esoteric manner, were you actually working on creativity or just a specific style of movement? And don't get me... Oh, yes, I'm still here.
Had a slight glitch in the matrix.
But that's fine. The matrix tends to do that.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I missed a lot of that. Could you maybe repeat some of that?
Yeah, sure. So one of the questions I pose to a lot of people when they come to coaching courses, and that often one of the exercises I get someone to do on a course is to run a session based on creativity, partly so that we can have this type of discussion, and partly because I think a lot of the methods that coaches use for trying to teach creativity don't necessarily work very well for that purpose, or at least they may work very well for what they're actually trying to do, but what they're trying to do isn't creativity. So the question I will always pose to students after they've gone through one of those sessions is, did you do anything new? Did you actually create something, or did you just choose from your existing toolbox of options? And a lot of the time they don't. And I think a lot of people get wrapped up in the idea they want to create something great immediately. And if you look at any other artistic medium, that's not the case. No one's first symphony is their best. No one's first painting is going to get sold for millions. Like, there is a lot of garbage along the way. And I think actually one of the most valuable things is, especially for people like me, because I tend to have a more mechanical way of thinking, and I certainly for a long time moving, it was a much more mechanical way of moving. But just getting people used to the idea of like doing trash, having stupid ideas that, okay, well, it was brand new, probably I'm never going to repeat that, but I still created something. And it's through that constant process that people are likely to then create something that either they're proud of or they want to try and replicate. So we can think of creativity in terms of a creative use of space and using it in new ways. We can think of it in terms of moving in new ways, even if the space is a very familiar one. But something that I think is actually the hardest thing to cultivate is the inclination to be creative. So there'll be some students who naturally want to do that. Yeah. And there'll be other students for whom this is very uncomfortable, unfamiliar territory and would much rather shy away from it. So one of our challenges as coaches is how do we try and make this feel like a more welcoming field of training to those people that maybe don't necessarily have an interest in it? Because it does expand your way of thinking. So if you're not willing to do that, you're also much more likely to just be waiting for instruction in other kind of areas and attributes of training. So I think cultivating this desire to be creative, or at least this willingness to try and create, is actually like a really, really important thing that we can do. And especially because a lot of artistic pursuits are things that a lot of people do at school. You do art at school, you do music at school, and then you go to university, and then probably you never do those again. And for sure, there are a lot of artists out there, but I think if you are naturally an artist, probably you either forget or just don't realize how many people give that up completely. So if movement is the medium through which we can allow people to have some artistic expression, even if parkour in some ways was born as a more locomotive or functional way of movement, I think it's one of the powerful things that we can do to actually change people's lives.
Yeah, I was speaking to another coach called Dom, who's from Norway, and he's part of his kind of company name is Team EXEO, and they make kind of parkour parks and stuff. And he mentioned two of his inspirations, Pedro Thomas and Slava Peten. Are you familiar with both of those guys?
Not the second one.
Okay. Slava is, I'm probably going to get this wrong. He's definitely, I think he's from Latvia, actually. Yeah, I think he's Latvian. Okay. Incredible mover, and definitely like I say back in the day, but that's for me like 2009, 2010. But yeah, and one thing that Dom was saying, which was linked to what you just mentioned, is that those two guys seemed they're in the realm of movement approach that seems most aligned with expression. And you see it in the videos that they are definitely not moving in the same way that, for example, Stora and the kind of, I guess, what's become a UK style, maybe you could say, which is characterized and influenced by people like Phil Doyle and from people in London. But yeah, I think that's fascinating, because a few very high level practitioners that I've trained with and stuff, some of them really bat on the idea of self-expression, and they say, well no, when I do parkour, it's work, it's development, it's progression, and I'm not expressing myself. But then when you watch people like Pedro and Slava, think, well, there's something a bit different. There is something different going on here. Whether it's right or wrong is another debate, but there's something different going on with their approach, and I find that like amazing,
Yeah, well, and I don't want to say that everyone's individual practice must be that, because I know at least one of the Stoa guys that is also like very musical. So it could well be that for him, that's his form of artistic expression, and that parkour is a much more physical practice. So I think on an individual level, everyone should be allowed to choose, is this a way that they want to express themselves, or is this a more athletic pursuit? But I think our job as coaches is to open that door for people.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think if we don't, then it's also unlikely for people for whom that isn't a very natural thing that they're going to find it on their own. So I think normalizing that, and purely if we're talking about kind of very creative or expressive movers, one of the very few people I follow on Instagram that I don't actually know in person is Luke Albrecht.
Oh,
I think I've said his name.
Yes, I'm very pleased you've mentioned him, because he's so underrated. It's criminal. He's so underrated.
I mean, I say there's very few people I follow, partly and quite a lot of parkour videos I don't watch, because at various times, almost every video has just become an identikit copy of a video that I've already seen. And I stopped being inspired to watch them because so much of it just felt like remakes or reruns of my favorites. But almost every clip he puts out is like, I don't know that I've seen that before. Like, that's a really interesting way of moving or way to use that space. And I just love that so much. It's also a much less well-known athlete. My youngest brother also practices parkour. One of the things I both like and respect about him is he'll just do what he wants to do most of the time. And sometimes that's like relatively weird stuff. Sometimes it's relatively normal. But I remember like years ago being at the chain store, and he was just like doing essentially like a huge diving Kong, but instead of going over it, he'd just like stop in an elbow lever on top of the obstacle.
Right.
And it's not that the act itself is either better or worse than anything else I've seen, but I'm just like, I just don't know if I've ever really seen anyone else do that. but that makes me like think of new possibilities, and so I find that kind of idea very inspirational.
And again, I'm so glad you mentioned Luke, because I've been watching him for a while now. I forget what his Instagram handle is. I'll put it in the description. But if you're watching this and you're interested in kind of the more creative side of things and using space in a very unusual way, I'll definitely check out Luke Albrecht. I can't remember his Instagram handle, but I'll put it all down below. But yeah, he very, very, I'd love to train with him. I really would. I think he's doing something quite different, and just seems like very competent, like across the board, like not just kind of with good flow or good movement. Or good like jumping, but like with his kind of acrobatic influence and stuff. And
yeah, I'd always be interested to see a lot of these people in just like a normal training session, because whenever you only know someone from their videos, I think it can be a little hard to get a sense of exactly what they're like. My feeling from all the things I've seen is that it's not just what he's doing, but the quality of his movement is very, very good. It's very smooth. It's very soft, in a way that some other well-known athletes that I won't name, but I do not get that impression watching their videos. Like, it feels a bit more kind of sloppy and kind of chucking stuff to do it. And but it could be that they're simply more honest and like, this was an attempt and it looks a bit sloppier. So like, I don't want to draw like conclusions. I don't want to say people are good or bad about it. But one of the things that always impresses me most is quality of motion. And I know, like, when I first started, Stefan was always Stefan Vigru, one of the second generation practitioners who learnt from David Bell, was always very keen on quality of movement being far more important than the scale. And it's one of the things that I try to impress upon my students. And it's actually one of the biggest challenges when you have someone who's naturally quite athletically gifted, but still relatively new to parkour, because actually scale will come quite easily to them. And what I want them to focus in on is doing things and smoothly and softly, and then expanding that into the scale that they already have. I think to some extent, it's also the same issue that a lot of parkour people have when they start climbing, which is we've got some strength, and we just tend to use that rather than climbing nicely. and it's really fun, which I think is why a lot of us do it. But I don't know that it's useful for the expansion and development of, in our case, our climbing practice. But for a lot of, let's say, natural athletes, or at least people that may have worked very hard to become athletes, but trying parkour for the first time and just immediately trying to use all of their physical capacity.
I think that's a nice analogy. Yeah, I think when I'm just thinking back to when I've gone to a climbing wall and just said, "Oh, I want to get that blue done," or "I want to get that," I just want to get it completed. There's a sense of quick achievement, I guess. But yeah, I actually started. I did some climbing lessons maybe a couple of years after starting parkour, and one thing I really found has stuck with me was that there's a coach who, oh man, I mean, you'd laugh if you saw where I started climbing, because it was just like this tiny leisure centre with a little climbing wall that had just been built, and they got this guy in, and he was a bit grumpy and a bit kind of he wasn't the warmest, I'll put it that way. But one thing that stuck with me is that I think there was maybe me and 2 or 3 other people in the class. It was very, very small kind of climbing class. And he said from the very start, I think we did like a 6-week course or something like that. And he said, okay, so, here's the climbing wall. And we looked up at it and thought, oh, wow, this is going to be great. And he said, we're not going to go up for 3 weeks. So we were all like, what do you mean? It's climbing. You go up. And he said, no, we're gonna use this. And he showed us this kind of part, which was just a traverse.
Right. Yeah.
We spent the next 3 weeks only doing traversing. He wouldn't let us go up at all. And at the time, that seemed very testing and very kind of, oh well, this isn't what climbing's about. Why are we learning all this stuff? But then actually, when we then started to go up, it was like, okay, so these are very important skills that need to be ingrained before you start adding height. And it really stuck with me, that one. So yeah.
Yeah, and actually it's easier to ingrain them in that more specific environment, whether in this case it was going sideways, or in parkour it might be deliberately having smaller scale for certain things.
Yeah.
Remove the temptation to cheat. Yes,
exactly. I was going to say, if you don't mind carrying on, we've been going for a while, but
I'm very happy to. I may pause you for a 1 minute lavatory break if that's okay.
Yep.
Go for it. I'm quite happy to continue. I'll be right back.
No problem.
Aha, I have returned.
Excellent. Cool. Okay, so I won't keep you forever, but one thing that I talked to the other coaches about was less about coaching and more about you. So I was wondering about if you could, if we could just chat a little bit about how your own practice is going, and
Sure.
How old are you now, Chris?
I am 36.
36. So you've been training for
17-ish years.
That's mad. Okay, so
it's crazy. I don't think I've said that out loud since it was 17. Like, there's always that moment where like the number goes up, and like you don't tell anyone for a while. So like in your head, it's not got that big. And I remember, because this is the crazy thing. If I now think back to when I started 2003, or even like the first time that I met, the first time I met Sebastian would have been, I guess, like 2000, either late 2003, early 2004, when he came over for one of the UF days. But he'd have been training for 17 years at that point. So it's like the people that I held in that regard, or that had that degree of experience at the beginning, at least purely in terms of years, I now find myself in a similar situation. So wow. It's a step change that kind of creeps up on you.
Well, I saw Seb at Chase Tag last year.
Oh, nice, yeah.
Was just, it's the first time I've seen him or met him in person, and was just amazed at how well he was moving, how well he was adapting to the challenge, how well he was going against the young guns, you know, from all over Europe. Incredible, absolutely incredible. And I do respect him a lot for how he's maintained, just maintained such a commitment, I guess, to parkour and the mission and everything. But yeah, I was going to ask you kind of, how's your training going right now? We'll start there. So how often do you train, or what do you focus on, and all that, apart from concussion?
Yeah. Well, lockdown has been very atypical for me. I say I'm very privileged to have my own garden and my own gym back there. But because I'm in the position, the very fortunate position that I get to travel so much of my work, it means that doing any kind of consistent strength training has been very difficult for me over the last few years, both through time and access to facilities. Whereas there's always opportunities for me to move. If I'm teaching a course, there might be some challenges I can join in on, or it might be that at the end of the day I get to stay in a nice spot and like do some challenges for myself or do some movement. So I've primarily been using lockdown just to try and get a couple of months of very solid strength training under my belt, because it's an opportunity that I'm unlikely to, or hopefully unlikely to have again. We'll see what happens with the management of the pandemic and all that. But I'm hopeful that this will be the only time I ever have 2 or 3 months relatively uninterrupted. And for me, even just having 3 months in London uninterrupted is very, very rare. But at least normally I'd still have classes and work and other commitments. Whereas now I've had time for myself. So I'm training. I think anyone that knows much about strength training would probably tell you that I'm overdoing it. And I'm sure Tom Taylor, being as knowledgeable as he is on the subject, would tear my current training plan apart. But I'm basically doing like a pulling day, pushing day, lower body day, and then a rest day and repeat. I've had a few acrobatic sessions in the garden, because again, it's something that when I travel, I don't have as much access to gyms and crash mats and that type of thing. So the last couple of months have been very focused on things that I don't normally get the time to do, which hasn't included a great deal of parkour movement. But I'm getting close to that changing, because like I've played around a little bit. I've got some scaffolding in my garden, so I've been up and over it, but I've not really been like drilling parkour movements. I've become just a bad weightlifter for a couple of months.
Well, it's funny you mention having the time to do strength work, because I guess for a number of reasons, but I feel the same. And I think that, you know, for me, the last couple of years have been essentially coaching 7 days a week, if not 6. And, you know,
very demanding.
Yeah, and you know, some of those days are literally 2 hours or 2 sessions. But having that kind of mental headspace of like, well, so if I work out now, am I going to be in an energetic state to be okay to do my sessions later? And that's been a real challenge for me, and I've found it difficult to kind of balance that. But so I understand completely what you mean, because I'm doing the exact same, and I'm, you know, working out more than I ever have, and definitely feeling that. Well, I guess thankful is the wrong word, but thankful for the time to be able to focus on it.
I think we can be grateful for the things that this has afforded us, even if we wouldn't wish it to have come about in such a way.
I'm following a similar thing. I'm actually, again, shout out to Chris Scott. Do you know Chris Scott?
I do. I believe he coaches with Jump Parkour in the Midlands.
Yes.
And if he's not still coaching with them, then he's very capable, I think, trained physio, very knowledgeable about a lot of things.
He is. And I definitely sought on his guidance for this period. So he's designed me a program to follow. Yeah, I highly respect Chris. He's had a lot of setbacks over the last few years, and I guess maybe has just, I don't know if there was a certain point of time, but he's really just completely dedicated himself to understanding biomechanics, training methods, how they can relate with parkour, and how to get stronger. Essentially, he's become somewhat of a strange gym wizard. He's tried some very unusual methods, and I'm sure has looked very deep into a lot of different methods. But what's interesting now is that he's the same age as me, so we're both 26, and
nice. Whole life ahead of you still.
Yeah, and he's now kind of coming back to parkour essentially, and is using all these strength gains, and it's crazy because he's just, I would say now he's probably in the best parkour form and strength form that I've ever seen him, and he's been training for a long time as well. But it's just, I think it's something very, very satisfying about seeing him absolutely crushing some attributes of parkour. So, for example, Chris is potentially going to beat the world record for the fastest 5 climb-ups time.
Oh, nice.
Which, as it stands, I think someone in America got about 8 point something. And I think that Chris is, well, he'll probably correct me on this, but he's not only going to try and beat that, I think he wants to try and beat 8 seconds, which is pretty crazy, to be honest.
I think anytime in any sport a record has a chance to be established, anything more than like a very incremental change is always like huge.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So he's doing that, and he's also practicing some acrobatic stuff and getting that all on lock, and it's exciting. And I don't know where I'm going with this. I think I was just kind of talking about just training methods and how they can apply. I talked to Tom Taylor a lot about whether he thinks that programming whether it's actually essential for progression.
What was his headline view on that?
Well, he sort of said that, from what I can remember, he said that to an extent, if you're wanting to take things more seriously, and there's things that work, there's things that are helping people get stronger and faster, and that they are really, if approached in a sort of dedicated way, they have a good chance of helping you improve.
Yeah. There's also like a huge difference between those members of the community that for whom competition is an important part of their training and their practice, because then you do start to have ideas of kind of peaking for competition and essentially having a much more strict season to the way you train, versus the idea of parkour simply as a lifelong practice and being kind of ready at any moment, and the journey being much more important than the peak. Whereas, I mean, competition in any sport is all about peaking at exactly the right moment, and how you behave in that moment. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't want to go down the competition philosophical rabbit hole, but it does mean that there's going to be a large number of people in the community that might benefit from certain practices in their training that won't be relevant to the rest of us. And it's the same if you look at general population, and if you're just trying to get fit and healthy, is following a bodybuilder's training program really the best way for the average person to get fit, healthy, and strong? Probably not, because their needs are completely different and their context is completely different. So it might be that there's a whole array of specific needs that people that are taking part in competitions, and how far apart they're spaced, and is it just for part of the year, and how do you use the rest of the year? I guess in the same way that people in incredibly cold countries, like in the UK, I think we're quite fortunate to be able to say, you just go out and train in all weathers. And I believe wherever possible that is the case. That's part of the natural adaptation of parkour. But if it's minus 40 and 3 foot of snow, sure, maybe try and go outside if it's safe for you to do so. But you're still going to be, even if you're taking the same mindset into your training, you're still going to be limited in the types of things that you can do, and maybe the things you might need to do to supplement your general physical well-being in those situations. And I guess competition places some of the same seasonal demands upon people.
So going back to yourself then, are there things that you are working towards or would like to achieve? I'm not sure if achieve is the right word, but are there attributes of your own training that you kind of want, or is it more just kind of maintaining a certain level and just enjoying it? Or how does it feel for you at the moment?
I think the only thing that I would specifically say I'd always like more, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'd love to be stronger and more powerful. But the one thing that my training is always geared around, I would say, is kind of being more consistent and more accurate. So not consistent in terms of how frequently I'm training, but consistent in terms of the quality and accuracy of my movement and my foot placement. And because I think it's both a marker of, for my personal practice, that I like to use for quality, but I think it also gives you a degree of confidence and opens up doors of things that you can do, because you know 10 times out of 10, 100 times out of 100, you're going to be within this range. And I think I'd like to think my quality and accuracy is reasonable, but it's something that I always think could be improved and could be better. I think in terms of real training goals, that's the one that permeates my training. It's not necessarily a recent thing. I think that's constant and ongoing. If I could pick out a couple of much more specific movement-based things, I was getting fairly close to doing an Arabian on flat on a sprung floor before this all kicked off. So that, because I think if I think of more classic parkour movements, it'd be nice to have a bigger scale to all of them, but that's very general. I'm happy just continuing to move and try and apply them in different situations and find weird challenges to see if I can do. So I don't necessarily have classic parkour movement aspirations, but over the last few years, I have become more interested in some of the more acrobatic or tricking side of stuff. Go to a local gymnastics place a couple of times a week when I happen to be in the country. And standing Arabian is the one that I think has been most dominant in something that I could actually do. Like I was trying to do twists. It took me a long time for my body to understand twisting in any kind of way. Like rotations, it was happy with, but twists were just utterly bizarre. So I'm getting closer to doing a front double twist into the foam pit, but not in a way that I think will ever be applicable for me, or applicable for me rather, in a real world environment. And I guess for me, I don't think people need to have this distinction, but I've always had a clear idea of what am I doing because it's fun to do in this gymnastic space, but I know it's basically staying here. And which of these skills are movement skills or techniques that I'd like to be able to apply in a whole range of environments. So a lot of the more basic flips and rotations are things that I am able and I want to be able to do in a broader range of contexts. But a double twisting front is really only something that I see as being, for me, a gymnastic trick. There'll be some athletes out there that will be happy doing that on grass or concrete or off walls and anything else. But I don't see that for myself, and I don't aspire to that for myself either. But yeah, if I could get the ability to do a standing Arabian just on a normal floor, it would be a really nice marker of like acrobatic progress, which is something that I have kind of spent some time trying to work on.
Yeah.
And it's also something that I can then just do should the mood take me. So
yeah, I've seen some people are changing their practice in different ways. So for example, some of the Leeds guys that I have trained with and who have inspired me quite a lot, they're now
is that from the Level Up or one of the other groups down that way?
I don't want to get in too much trouble, but I would say they're not really associated with
people from Leeds. Sure.
People from, yeah, as in they train at Level Up, but I think they've always been their own group.
Okay, yeah, sure.
But yeah, they've started like skateboarding, and
nice.
It's interesting to me to see them adapting to, I guess, a new start point. You know, some of them have never done any skateboarding before, but are now consistently practicing in a very, very similar way to how they first started parkour, I imagine, and getting that same sense of, I guess, sense of achievement from small progressions.
Yeah.
But also,
no, I was just going to say one of the really interesting things. I'd love to see some hard data on this because, like, it's just a feeling. It's not just a feeling I have. It's the impression that I have from the people that I know. But I have this very strong impression that parkour people are much more likely to kind of spread into trying other disciplines and other activities than people I know that are interested in other sports or activities. So I've got a whole bunch of friends that play football, and really, like, that's their thing. They're happy with that staying their thing. Not a criticism, not good or bad. But most people I know from parkour, whether it's trying skateboarding, trying more traditional gymnastic type stuff, trying hand balancing, getting into weightlifting,
absolutely,
juggling, circus, acro yoga. I mean, I still remember like 2 years, I'm going to say it was about 2007 or 2008, where a significant, much higher chunk of the parkour community than the normal community got really good at doing Rubik's Cube. Like, that was the thing, because it was just like, okay, this is another random little challenge we can do, and I forget the name of it, but the little like spike with the cups on the side and the ball on the string. Kendama. Massive. But I think just the inquisitive nature of the average parkour practitioner, and the kind of, it leads them to going down these paths and trying these things. And for me, I couldn't say that when you're doing that you are doing parkour, but it is an extension of your parkour practice in the sense that this desire to explore and challenge yourself spills over into other things. So yeah, I'm not going to say that everything is parkour and go like completely zen on this, but I do think the mindset that one develops through parkour means you are much more likely to just spiderweb to lots of other different things, whether those are physical pursuits or other interests.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I would love to see some sort of data on that. I remember a good friend of mine who, he got into Rubik's Cube, but then at the same time was also doing plate spinning, juggling, handstand work, and tending the chickens in his backyard. Like it just very. We're an eclectic bunch, very eclectic bunch.
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting to see a lot of the parkour gyms or businesses, like, I think partly through business modeling, but also partly through their nature, combining with other activities or sports in their spaces. So whether it is, I know the Level Up Gym in Leeds has a lot of cheerleading groups that go there as well. At the chain store for a long time, we had a CrossFit group that ran out of there. Access Parkour up in Edinburgh, Room to Move, their space is also a shared circus space as well. So it's interesting to see the other kind of disciplines that coexist with parkour in those spaces and the crossbreeding between the two.
Absolutely, yeah. And going back to kind of different, I guess maybe different trails of thought of getting older and changing your practice. I was listening to the Height Drop podcast, and they were speaking with Phil Doyle, and Phil seems to, I think he's based in Bristol at the moment, and he seems to have this idea. He has an idea of making 5, in some ways, send-off videos. I kind of, it's definitely, it's made me think a lot, actually. And I think Phil is maybe a few years old, maybe a couple of years older than me, perhaps. I think
he's somewhere in the middle, because I've got a very loose memory of I think it was a 13-year-old Phil Doyle coming down to Harrow, like many years ago. I mean, like 2005 or 6, I think. So like it's got to be, I think, late 20s.
Yes, yeah, definitely. But it was interesting hearing him talk about this feeling of peaking and of kind of wanting to, this slight pressure of wanting to kind of achieve his movement dreams before he can't achieve them anymore. And I was wondering what you, I mean, kind of, you're 10 years ahead of me, and how do you feel about that sort of issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I also think that if you take someone like Phil Doyle, he's in a different position in that he's a lot more famous, certainly as a mover. And I think that probably does come with like a lot of pressure, whether that's internalized or whether it's pressure that he's put on himself or whatever it is. So I wonder if that's for him or others in a similar situation, put this kind of pressure on I need to represent my peak. And also, actually, the way I'm defining my peak is in terms of physical scale or difficulty.
Yeah.
Because I think that's like a different way of framing it, because like a peak could just be, it could be when I was able to do the biggest physical movements. It could be when I went the longest time without picking up an injury. It could be the time when I was happiest and consistent in my training. Like there's all different ways of doing it, and it's so natural to fall down the classic sporting rabbit hole of your peak is just when I was at my athletic peak for speed, distance, whatever it is. So because those peaks may come at very different times, and if it's like, when was my best athletic peak, like it's not impossible that those days are past me. I'd like to think it's not, and actually there are ways that I feel stronger and more rounded now than I was in the past, even if there's some specific elements where I know I was stronger in the past. But if my peak is when am I going to come up with my most interesting stuff, well, then there's every chance that's still in the future. So, but yeah, so if I were to try and define my peak for myself, like, I don't know that has come yet. And also, I don't like the idea of feeling that the peak's here, because it means that when you're descending, you know you're on your way down. Whereas if I don't know when my peak is, like, this could just be part of my natural fluctuations in training. Can you hear me? Are you there? Am I talking to myself? Oh. But you could also measure your peak as like, well, just how close am I to my maximum potential at this time, at this age? Which I also think is a much more useful way of doing it, because if you're, let's take a crazy example. If you're a 70-year-old and you're running a 15-second 100-meter sprint or something, I mean, I'm not even sure if that's physically possible. I'm not quite sure where the limits are. But the point is, you're much closer to the peak of not just your potential, but even human potential, than a 30-year-old running a 13-second thing. So like measuring your peak by the best that you ever were, rather than the best that you can be now, just isn't a way I like to think of my kind of performance. And I think it sets yourself up for a lot of potential kind of negative feeling towards this idea of decline, rather than I'm the best I can be now. And like for me, the practice is always linked to, like, it is a practice of longevity and a lifelong pursuit. So it's about being as strong and capable as I can be for life. And that can only be true for the context in which I find myself. So as that context changes, as long as my expectations change with it, I can still be happy and successful in the goals that I set for myself. But then there's also another difference in that I'd like to think that I'm, just as a human animal, I'm a reasonable athlete. But I also don't think I've ever been a great athlete. So I don't know that I've ever got that close to hitting my potential. So it might be that as my potential is declining, I'm just getting closer to it.
I've never thought of that before, but yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Well, whereas if you are maybe a Phil Doyle or a Kai or someone like that, if you're much closer to your physical potential, that's not an avenue that's open to you. Whether that's like a physical thing or just a comforting lie that I tell myself, it's still something that is true. So I don't know what it would be to feel like if I was closer to that. But I think the nature of your practice changes, both like with your age, with your experience, and there's a lot of people. I say we've had students in their 50s, 60s, older, coming to class who are potentially moving the best that they ever have. So the idea that someone in that situation is like past their peak, like I think I would just reject as a way of thinking about it at all. But whilst also recognizing there's a difference between someone being in their 60s and the most comfortable they've ever been balancing on a bar or at height or jumping, whatever it may be, and someone who is moving in a way that is not as large in scale as they were doing 20 or 30 years ago. So it's not a value judgment about which is right or wrong, just that those two people are having very different lived experiences of what maybe jumping the same distance feels like to them.
Yeah, well put. I had a message on Facebook the other day from a friend of mine who's keen to go to Leeds next year. So a good friend of mine, Elliot, we've been to Leeds twice, fortunately, and he's been with me both times. So he's kind of we've got very good memories. Sorry,
he's kind of nudging you to do it again.
Well, yes. I mean, his idea is that there's a group of us that have kind of stemmed from York, including him, and we have separated in different ways. We live in different places now, and his idea was that let's try and organise a Lease trip for next year to kind of bring everyone together and just not necessarily focus on training all day like we did those times in Lease, but just getting back together and just going and having fun, really. But what's interesting in my mind is that every time I think of Lease, I think of the pivotal aspects of this area, and manpower is something that I've looked at twice.
Right.
The first time I looked at it, and I was maybe 19, 20, and I thought, not a chance. There's no way that I'm risking, my life essentially to try this one jump. Went back a few years ago, looked at it again, and thought, well, it's actually not as bad as I remember, but I'm still not in the right physical realm generally, but in the actual moment, I'd been training loads and I was achy, and it just wasn't a good idea to take that sort of drop, in that sort of state. But now, thinking ahead to 2021, and I'm feeling, I guess, well, I'm definitely on an ascending strength curve, I guess you could say, in my legs and ability and stuff. And I'm thinking, well, should I spend the next kind of year or so having that as a very real, very real goal, and questioning whether do I actually want to do this? Why do I want to? And what does it represent for me? Because even just the thought of it like makes me feel nervous. But part of those nerves, I think, is definitely the knowing that I probably could do it. Side prees are not my thing, but I have taken a few hefty drops in the course of my training. So I guess I was wondering, in your case, whether there, maybe more specifically, there are any things that you've had your eye on for a while that you think, I wouldn't mind getting that done.
Well, it's weird. I've came across a little piece of paper that I wrote, I don't know, it was like 10 years ago, maybe more, could have been before I moved house. But on it, I had a combination of two different things. I had a bunch of physical targets, whether it is squatting a certain amount or whatever it may be. But also like a list of specific jumps around London, like some of which don't exist anymore. But it's about the last time that I can remember really specifically having like these specific targets, or like movement targets of things I'd like to do. And like there's definitely merit to it. Like always, like goal setting within any discipline can help provide structure and focus to your training. It can potentially help provide motivation, and it also can help be one criteria of success of, okay, I set this target, I achieved this thing, I've at this point, however narrow or broad you choose to define that. But also, if I think of a lot of my proudest achievements, but they're just like things that I was able to do and not necessarily things that I'd like worked up to. And in some cases, they might be things that I wouldn't have even seen if I'd been more zeroed in on this very specific target. Like I can't remember. Like, at Denmark last year, when I was at the international gathering in Gerlo, there was just kind of a jump that I was particularly pleased about being able to do, but also because this was like the 8th or 9th time I'd gone, and I'd never seen it before. Like I hadn't seen anyone else do it, and it had never occurred to me as one for the future. So like the fact that not just that I was able to do it, but I was able to see it was like a really happy achievement for me. And it was also like very personal, because it was just like, okay, well, I've seen this thing, and the only thing that's going to determine if I do it or not is like, am I able to bring myself to do it? And so there's going to be loads of people for whom they do have like a significant personal reason. And like in your case, it might be, well, I remember what this jump looked like when I was 19. I remember what it looked like when I was 20, whatever. So like, this is a personal mark of progress in like how my like relationship to this jump has changed as a reflection of my training. And I think that is I think that is different to just going there and doing this jump because you know that other people have done the jump. So I think if people have got those jumps because they've developed an existing relationship with this challenge, they can be really useful as, okay, I want to go and do this thing. But I guess I've just kind of avoided developing those relationships with individual jumps or movements for a long time now. And so I don't necessarily have any, okay, I would like to do this thing. There's definitely nothing that immediately springs to mind.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe one of the reasons I asked you as well is because I think there is a slight growing trend of having these things in mind. Again, you know, whether that's right or wrong, but for example, I don't know whether you've read Callum Tip 500.
I've read some of Callum's tips. I couldn't tell you which one was which. This isn't like I don't know if you're a Red Dwarf fan, but this isn't like Crichton being able to recite every single space call directive.
Yeah. Well, he specifically wrote I guess you could say an essay for tip 500, and it's caused quite a
stir.
A stir, maybe. Yeah, I guess maybe a positive stir. It's not really. No one. I think very few people tried to argue with Callum, maybe you could say, as in
let's hear what the tip is and we'll decide if they should have argued with him or
yeah. I mean, but one aspect that he talks about is this idea of kind of that you, in order to have a little bit more, he talks about structure. He talks about that a lot of people are very happy training and very proficient at going out and doing their thing, but he talks more specifically about how if you actually are serious about getting better, then you need to add some structure to your sessions, in the same way that in a workout you do 5 sets of 5 at a certain weight. He said that maybe some people, it would be beneficial for them to use that type of approach with their parkour training, so going out and doing 10 rail precisions at waist height, for example, but then it, tied into this is the idea of having specific movement aims. So, for example, you have a local spot, and he kind of suggests that you should make a list. You should make a list of the things and have it written down. The things that you think, I want to try and get this, I want to try and get that, because it not necessarily that's the best thing to do generally, but for you to focus on having something to work towards. I'm not contending with your view, but I just find it interesting how there are different parts.
Well, I'd say I don't know that I was necessarily advocating my viewpoint as being a wider one that should be shared, as much as kind of explaining what my personal viewpoint is.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely. I think the important thing is for a lot of people, having some kind of goal setting or having something to reach towards is important to provide that structure. So I guess I agree with the base of Callum's tip, and I think that is one way of providing that structure. And if people maybe lack it or find that they are being very unfocused, then using that method to achieve that aim could work well. But I think it's still, by the time, so if you take your local spot, choose 10 things that you want to do, it's like by the time I can do some of those, I might have seen something more interesting. And
yeah.
And so why does that thing that I wrote down a year ago have more relevance or importance in this new, much more interesting thing that I've potentially seen that is in itself potentially a result of my training?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
So it's certainly not to fight against the view. I think it will provide structure for a lot of people that need it, and ways of measuring success. And I'd also say that the idea of having some kind of structure to your movement training sessions, maybe it feels like this is a new thing, but it's also
I thought you might say
it's also a really old thing. Some of the very, very early trainings were definitely just going on movement adventures, but some of them we're going to go and break this jump today, and you just think about the jump the whole time that you're walking there, and then that's your target for the session. So I think in some ways it would bear a lot more similarity to the very earliest types of training session, and maybe just over time people have lost sight of that as one available training methodology, just into I'll go out and do whatever I feel like at a jam. So I would definitely co-sign his idea that having purpose to your training sessions is going to be valuable and important for the majority of people. Exactly how you frame that can change, maybe.
Yes, I had a feeling you might say that. Yeah, I do find that super interesting. That he's kind of, I guess it feels more like kind of like shake shaking is not the right word at all, but just kind of a bit of a like there's definitely a feeling amongst people that train of this looseness, this freedom, and I've talked about it in another in another interview, podcast, whatever. And it definitely feels that what you're talking about and what Callum's talking about is kind of a bit of a grabbing you by the shoulders and being like, hang on a minute, you can't just play with kendama all day. You can't
Yeah.
you can't just do a couple of flips and then leave. Like if you do want to progress, there are things that maybe you should consider. So I I find that funny because also, you know, every instance that I've engaged with Parkour Generations, I have been sore in some way afterwards, and whether that's oh, have we still got you?
Yeah, I got as far as every instance you've been in Parkour Generations, you have been.
Oh, what a terrible!
I know, right?
I said the word sore.
I mean that's also possible.
Yeah, but I think that those instances have definitely, yeah, given me perspective on like, well, you know, this is your body, this is your muscle and bone and fat and
Yeah,
structure of your whole being. Like you need to put some work in. It's not just going to change, you know. It's not going to change because you want it to change. You're going to have to put in work, essentially.
yeah. I mean, I would add. It's just going to sound like I'm defending us here, but I think a useful context for people that are listening to it is that the intention of our training and the intention of anyone's training, whatever methodology you're following, shouldn't be to make you sore. So it's not like the training is designed to make people feel sore and it will keep getting pressed to that point. It's simply if you are unfamiliar with training, and it doesn't have to be in like the way that those experiences were for you. It could be if you're just going out doing 100 massive running jumps. Like if you've not done that before, it will make you sore, and that's just a piece of feedback about how ready your body was for those stresses.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because those are, I mean, any kind of feedback for your body is useful because it's telling you something about what you're doing. And actually, probably the hardest thing for individuals to discern is like, well, is it telling me something about how hard I was training, what I was training, how frequently I was training, like what kind of, how much rest am I getting in the rest of my life? Like, there's so many variables that affect that. So, like, kind of knowing the lesson is one thing, but knowing what the lesson is trying to tell you is a different and much harder thing.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're approaching 2 hours, so that's been a pretty mammoth chat, and it's
I enjoyed it.
yeah, me too, man. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that it would be great to do this again at some point because we've not even touched on. Well, to be honest with you, I'd love to hear more about Parkour Generations and how they are going forward, and what their what their
Aims.
yeah exactly, with moving forward, and how they are as a as a company and as an organization. But I also you know, definitely for another podcast. But it'd be great to hear your views on FIG and developments in that area. I believe you're pretty tied to, because I mean, I'll be honest, I've lost track, but I get the impression that you're quite on track with things to do with FIG.
Well, I'm obliged to be at least partly on track because I'm one of the directors of Parkour Earth. And what, certainly by no means the only thing that we're focused on, but one of the things that we are most focused on is trying to help maintain autonomy for the parkour community at large. And hopefully we aim to we aim to be a useful vehicle for the community through which to maintain control of their own practice.
Yeah.
But the ultimate goal is to make sure that people that practice and live parkour are the ones that help to get shape its future and its spread and its wider kind of public conception of what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, definitely for another chat, I think.
Yeah, man, we can put some time in it.
Yeah, but yeah, again, thank you so much, man. I definitely want to say, well, personal thank you again for helping me get my level 2.
You're welcome.
That has significantly changed my life, and also, yeah, thank you for continuing to do what you do, helping other coaches, and being a good role model. So I appreciate that, Chris.
I appreciate that, man. Thank you very much.
And yeah, hopefully, well, I'm going to have, by the end of all these podcasts, I'm going to have a long list of places I want to try and get to try and train with people. So I will let you know when I'm in London next. And
do it.
You never know. We might be able to get a session or something.
Yeah, hopefully before 2022.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I will stop recording there and pretend to say goodbye because it's the end of the video. But we'll,
Yeah.
So thank you so much, and yeah, stay safe, man.
Will do. Thanks, buddy. You too.
See ya.